Hello again, folks. Mark Hasara, KC-135 pilot, weapons officer, joint specialty officer. The Lessons from the Cockpit Show, episode number 112. This one's going to be a little more current events, though. On the Lessons from the Cockpit Show, we interview some of the most fascinating and intriguing pilots, aircrew members, maintainers, aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. We want to hear their stories, but more importantly, what they learned from being in these extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and even general aviation environments. Why do we do this? To show how the aviation world works, but more importantly, increase critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. A lot of the stories that we hear on the Cockpit Show are being told for the very first time. As I mentioned, we're going to do current events. There's a lot going on in the Middle East. And there's one question that I've been asked a lot, and we'll get in that here in a few minutes. Folks, if you haven't checked out Valorous TV, please go by their YouTube channel, which is free at Valorous TV. You're really missing out if you haven't done this, folks, because Valorous TV, it's a new and ultimate destination for streaming great videos, documentaries, movies that are handpicked. There's hundreds of them, and they cover military, police, first responders, and everyday patriots, courageous heroes, and they've got great content, folks. So please go by Valorous TV at Valorous TV on YouTube. Okay, on today's show, I'm getting asked the same question a lot. And folks, it's a valid question. And that question is, where does it stop? In the Middle East, with all the things that are going on, Mark, where does this stop? How does it stop? What does it look like when it stops? So, what I want to do today is kind of like an on the nation's dime, but also some lessons learned from previous events where we should have stopped sooner or we didn't stop at the right time. And I just want to discuss with you a little bit about, again, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. How do we know when to cease fire? How do we know when to pull back and just go, okay, we're done now? So grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in. Let's begin Lessons from the Cockpit Show and talk about military planning and how do you figure out when to culminate and what that requires. When I was teaching at the Joint Forces Staff College, I was in the Combined Warfighter School, the Joint Combined Warfighter School. What this school is teaches campaign planning at all levels, crisis action planning, deliberate planning, adaptive planning to our U.S. service members, members of our own government, and of course to our international partners. So our sister services, U.S. Air Force, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, that all makes sense. Teaching planning. And this course was developed for individuals that were going to Joint Force Commanders staffs. This was like the education that you required before going on to, say, the Ninth Air Force planning staff or a Marine Corps headquarters, things like that. Now, as far as our uh, government agencies, we had a lot of them. We had folks from uh, the CIA. I had a CIA guy in one of my classes, uh, folks from DITRA, folks from the National Intelligence Agency, NIA, just a lot of folks that would come through just so that they could understand this is how the military plans. And when I say military, all the agencies that are associated with it also. which can be hundreds, particularly when you start adding non-government agencies like humanitarian groups, things like that. This school I was assigned to right after I left the Combined Air Operations Center at Prince Sultan as the chief of the air fueling control team. So I thought I knew a lot about planning, but there's a whole publication. It's called Joint Publication 5. I'm going to put a link in the show notes below to the one that I was using because it is the closest to the one that I was teaching. Now, I was there from 2003 through 2006. The joint publication I have down there is 2011, but it's pretty close to the one that I used when I was teaching. And one of the things that I learned while there and I was teaching was what's called the elements of operational design. When you go about crisis action planning, meaning you've got some crisis somewhere in the world that you got to react to now, like the long range strike against Iran, there's certain planning functions and procedures you go through. If you're doing deliberate planning, such as the 1003 Victor plan in 2002, 2003, which we used to invade Iraq, that also uses the same elements of design. When you do contingency operations, and believe me, we do a lot of planning for contingency operations in the military, you go through this process of, what's the problem? How do we fix the problem? What are some courses of action? Which courses of action actually solves the problem? And then basically building a plan and putting on a shelf, or actually going out and doing it if it's crisis action planning because the event's already happening. This kind of planning process happens all the time. There are plans being built now for events around the world. Uh, Notice that Iran's been quiet. We struck once and pulled back. And one one thing that I learned when I was doing this is you do it backwards. First, you ask yourself, what is the end state? What is it that we want Iraq or Iran or whatever to look like when we're done? The second thing you have to figure out is, when do we stop military operations? So just real quickly, let me go through the elements of operational art so that you know what they are. They are termination, military end state, objectives, meaning what are you trying to do, effects, which can be kinetic and non-kinetic to make a change on something, center of gravity, which is the hardest thing to figure in certain circumstances. What are Iran's center of gravity? Well, the religious ruling class, the mullahs, is one. Well, what props them up? Well, that's the military. So that becomes a what we call a center of gravity or a cog. How do you define cog? Clausewitz describes it in his book on war as the hub of all power and movement. Whatever that hub of all power and movement that keeps a country or a regime going is a center of gravity. Now, of course, there may be multiples, such as the military. Well, what portion of the military is the actual center of gravity? Is it their Air Force? Is it their Navy? Is it the ground war? Figuring out these centers of gravity can sometimes be very tough because you focus in on those things. And We tend to look at everything with our Western civilization eye, and it's led us astray a couple times, particularly in Iraq. We basically mirrored our way of thinking on Saddam, not realizing that he was a true dictator and that anybody that opposed him was eliminated post haste. Okay. All right. Decisive points. Decisive points are just what it sounds like, geographical locations where you can really tie down the enemy. Lines of operation and lines of effort all have to do with how do we achieve our objectives? What forces do we use? What tools of national power do we use to do that? Direct and indirect approach. You can go directly at a target or, say, a surface to air missile site. You can kill it with a harm and cluster bombs, or you can just jam it like crazy or hijack the network using senior suitor. Anticipation, operational reach. We just proved with the B-2 strike, we have operational reach. There is no place on the planet that we cannot get a B-2 to. We can't get a B-2 that we are distinctly capable of putting a B-2 or some of our forces over the top of it, no matter what. Culmination. When do you lose momentum is basically the definition of that. We'll look at that in just a second. Arranging operations. We had a quote on the board for Iraqi freedom that said, "Dude, you're getting a TLAM." Okay, because it didn't make sense to send an F-117 over the top of it because of operational risk. All right, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Forces and functions are exactly what it sounds like. What group of forces, the Army, ground war, what functions do we want it to perform? That's what that's about. So those are the elements of operational design. Now, let's look at termination, military end state, and culmination just real quick. Joint Publication 5 defines termination as effective planning cannot occur without a clear understanding of the end state and the conditions that must exist to end military operations. Knowing when to terminate military operations and how to preserve achieved advantages is key to achieving the national strategic end state. To plan effectively for termination, the supported Joint Forces commander must know how the President and SecDef intend to terminate the joint operation and ensure that its outcomes endure. Did you catch that last word? Endure. Didn't do a lot of enduring after the fall of Iraq. And folks, I don't know if you know, there was a very clear, very well-developed plan to rebuild Iraq after the war. It was done at the Army's War College. Conrad Crane and a group of his really, really smart people, and they based it on the rebuilding of Japan and the rebuilding of Germany. One's called Operation Blacklist. I can't remember I can't right off the top of my head remember the other one. Okay. But those operations run by MacArthur and the Pacific and oh, Marshall in Europe were successful. And the Iraq rebuilding plan was based off of both of those. And I one time had an electronic copy of it. I don't now. It was very detailed. It went through all of the four elements of national power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, and was a pretty surefire plan that we didn't follow. And then everybody just kind of poo-pooed, just no, don't want to do that. Anyway, so let's continue on with termination here. Termination criteria are developed first among the elements of operational design, which I just read to you, as they enable the development of the military end state and objectives. Termination criteria describe the standards that must be met before conclusion of the joint operation. Commanders and their staffs must think through in the early stages of planning. Think through in the early stages of planning, not the end of the operation, but during planning. The conditions that must exist in order to terminate military operations on terms favorable to the U.S. and its multinational partners. A hasty or ill-defined end to the operation may bring with it the possibility that the adversary will renew hostilities or other actors may interfere, leading to further conflict. What does that sound like? The end of the Iraq War in 2003, 2004. Commanders and their staffs must balance the desire for quick victory with termination on truly favorable terms. Let me read that again. Commanders and their staffs must balance the desire for quick victory with termination on truly favorable terms. Military end state. Let's define that. Military end state is the set of required conditions that defines achievement of all military objectives. It normally represents a point in time and or circumstances beyond which the president does not require the military instrument of national power as the primary means of achieving remaining national objectives. Did you get that? Military end state means from here on out, the diplomatic, informational, and economic elements are the lead, and military backs off. While it may mirror many of the conditions of the national strategic end state, the military end state typically will be more specific and contain other supporting conditions. Those conditions contribute to developing termination criteria, the specified standards approved by the president and or the SecDef that must be met before the joint operation can conclude. Aside from its obvious associated with strategic and operational objectives, clearly defining the military end state promotes unity of effort, facilitates synchronization, and helps clarify and may reduce the risk associated with the campaign or operation. Now, there's one other one I want to read real quick, and that is culmination. Culmination is that point in time and or space at which the operation can no longer maintain momentum. Let me read that again. Culmination is that point in time and or space at which the operation can no longer maintain its momentum. In the offensive, the culminating point is the point at which effectively continuing the attack is no longer possible, and the force must consider reverting to a defensive posture or attempting an operational pause. Here, the attacker greatly risks counterattack and defeat and continues the attack only at great peril. A defender reaches culmination when the defending force no longer has the capability to go on the counteroffensive or defend successfully. Success in the defense is to draw the attacker to offensive culmination, then conduct an offensive or expedite the adversary's defensive culmination. During stability operations, meaning the rebuilding of a country phase, that's stability operations. Culmination may result from the erosion of national will, decline of popular support, questions concerning legitimacy or restraint, or lapses in protection leading to excessive casualties. That defines what happened after the invasion of Iraq. Let me read that again. During stability operations, in other words, the rebuilding of the nation. Culmination may result from the erosion of national will, decline of popular support, which we had, questions concerning legitimacy or restraint, or lapses in protection leading to excessive casualties. We had all those at the end of the Iraq War, all of them. Our national will just wasn't there because guys and gals were getting killed. Well, guess who they're getting killed by? ISIS and Hezbollah, the Iranian proxy for guerrilla warfare that was being led by Major Qasem Soleimani, an Iranian general. An Iranian general. Okay, let me just go through this again real quick. Make sure I got everything. Ranging operations, no. Don't need that. Anyway, let me just reiterate what these elements of operational design are. Termination, which I read to you. Military end state, which I read to you. Objectives, effects, center of gravity or centers of gravity. Very hard to define some places, okay? Decisive points, lines of operation and lines of effort, direct or indirect approach, anticipation, operational reach, culmination, arranging operations, and forces and functions. So now you understand what we mean when we say culminate, we're going to lose momentum. Terminate, where we may have reached our end states, and military end state, where the military is no longer the viable option. It's time to put the military to bed and let the diplomatic, informational, and economic pieces do their thing. But guess which one we always go to? Even when we're having a disaster inside the United States. Lieutenant General Honore, 101st Airborne, where does he go? Louisiana, New Orleans, Nolens, to help clean up the mess by Hurricane Katrina. Because we know that the military, when given a task, can usually perform it. So, again, when we talk about the elements of national power, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic dime, I want to talk specifically right now about end state objectives, culmination, termination, where the military piece is concerned. I had a conversation with a gentleman today who is not for the current administration in any way, shape, or form. And that conversation was, we don't know what happened inside the Fordow plant with these two bombs. And of course, he was just saying, this was reckless. And I had to say, what is our military end state for Iran? The one objective that the president has said is Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. All of their neighbors know if the mullahs ever got a hold of nuclear weapons, the Middle East would be toast, or other locations, both on our continent, the United States of America, and Europe. Suitcase bomb. And of course, over the weekend, I'm sure some of you saw that one of the mullahs actually put out a religious fatwa meaning like a religious message going, Trump and Netanyahu are enemies of God. They must be destroyed, eliminated. Hard to negotiate with that. But what I want to continue talking about here is, when do you know to cease fire? When do you know going back to Iran to bomb whatever will cause us to lose momentum because we've lost the will of the people back here in the States? And that was one of the big things about Caspar Weinberger and his doctrine when he was the Secretary of Defense in Reagan. His last one was, we had to have the support of the American population. And of the 5 criteria that he had, that was the biggest one. Above all else, if the American people don't support it, we don't do it. I think with this latest airstrike, most Americans approved, at least the ones I've been talking to, with very few exceptions. Even this gentleman I was talking to this morning, who is greatly opposed to just about everything the Trump administration was doing, even he said taking out Fordow, Isfahan, Natanz was the right thing to do based on the information that we had. And we all know, you know, how the intel on Iraq went. So let me uh, teach you something that, again, I learned while I was at the Joint Forces Staff College, since we're talking about risk. We had a brigadier general from the Army come speak to us one day, and he had written a book called Warfare in the 21st Century. And he laid on us something that I wrote down that I have gone over and over and over and over again in my mind, because it literally is the thinking process that most of us go through. And that is what he called the elements of the decision maker's dilemma. Those 4 elements are, first of all, risk. What's the risk of doing this? What's the risk of going to Iran and taking out the Fordow enrichment facility underground? Second one, risk. Second one was time. How much time do we have? And is time working against us or for us? Okay. Risk, time. The third one was quality of knowledge. The SecDef, under the order of the president, felt that the quality of knowledge that they had, that uranium was being enriched in Fordow, Natanz, and that there was enough to make nuclear weapons, must have been pretty big, must have been pretty high for them to say, we can take this risk. And then, of course, the last one is outcomes. So you have risk, time, quality of knowledge, and outcomes. And what he said was, what this Brigadier General Hall was his name. Okay, I think it was Wayne Michael Hall. What he said was, if you have quality knowledge that comes in a timely manner, you can reduce risk because you act with more certainty with a reduction in second and third order effects. If you have really, really good intel, like we had when we went after bin Laden, knowing that he was in that house, knowing we had established the patterns of life, knowing that he would be there when Rob O'Neill and SEAL Team 6 showed up, we didn't operate under the risk of going in and it's a dry hole, he's not here. They knew he was going to be there. At the same time, Rob O'Neill says, one of his buddies said, I know I shouldn't ask this, but we got to ask, are we coming back from this? If we do this, are we coming back? And they're doing a risk assessment. What is the risk of doing this? What is the risk of going to Iran, dropping these 30,000-pound bombs on these places? Because we're going to get opposed, or so we thought. So risk, time, quality of knowledge, and outcomes is the basic process all of us go through when we make a decision. If I spend this much money on this product, is it going to last me a while? Is it not? What are the outcomes? Anyway, back to military end state. Now that we've attacked Iran, now that we've gone in and attacked these 3 sites, one of the things that you had to be very careful of is, of course, how the American people are going to take this. But do we stop at one airstrike? Is it going to take another one to go after these places? Now, Natanz is buried, the facility is buried much deeper. Even the GBU 57s can't get down that far. But still, they had to assess what happens if we have to do a reattack. Well, during this flight over Iran, all the reports that are coming back are they didn't fire a shot, which leads me to believe they didn't know they were there. Leads me to believe, again, our stealth technology works. Because we can literally go anywhere on the planet and attack something and be impervious to self-defense, air defenses. You have to be really, really careful, folks, when you've got that kind of power. Really careful. When you have that kind of technology that allows you to go anywhere on the planet and attack anything, knowing they're not going to see you or have very low probability of seeing you. So now, what's the military end state? Well, President Trump said, you guys can't have these kind of weapons. But let's peel the onion back a little bit. Okay, the nuclear force. We got it. Understand that. Iranians can't have a nuclear weapon. But what about all the things that prop up that weapon system? Air Force, rocket forces, maybe naval forces. Certainly in our Navy, we have nuclear weapons on our submarines that make them an extremely capable offensive weapon. So I'm sure there was a big discussion on 1 strike, 2 strike, 3 strike. What happens if some of the weapons missed? The TLAMs going to Natanz had missed. The GPS was out in that area or didn't have full coverage that allowed them to zero in on, less than a millimeter instead of greater than a millimeter. Those are the things you got to think about too. But what is our military end state? What do you leave Iran with? What do you leave Iran with militarily so that they can defend themselves from whatever enemies that they have. And I remember going through a class and we had this discussion with the students during an exercise. Well, are you going to leave them those tanks? What about those patrol boats? Which one's more offensive than the other? Or which one can be used as an offensive tool? The tank or the patrol boat? Well, let's see. What happens if they clog up the Strait of Hormuz, the economic FDO by the Iranians? What will that do? What will that cause us to do? Well, we send the hogs to Al Udeid and we just open that puppy right back up again. So one of the things that you have to figure out in your military end state is, what do you leave Iran with? Assuming that, I can't believe I'm saying this, assuming that we do go to war, there is world war between Iran and us and whoever, coalition partners. Do you leave the mullahs in place? That is not a military target, that is a diplomatic target, but it has military implications because they run the show. More importantly, how do you get the mullahs to leave? And once they leave, where do they go? Where do they go? Because as all of you know, you can't paint an animal into a corner because they fight more ferociously when they see no other options. And, here's something one of the people that I worked with and I taught with told me too, was in this war in the Middle East, you have to remember they are risk averse, meaning they're willing to take bigger risks because to them it's religious. If I do this, I'm going to paradise. So when you're developing your military end states, your culmination and termination criteria, you have to take that all into account. And we as Americans don't do that. We made a huge mistake in mirroring our thinking and culture on Saddam. And one of the generals that was interviewed after the war, said, you crazy Americans, you think that everybody thinks like you. That's not the way it works in Iraq. And he told the story that here's how Saddam solidified his power ruthlessly. He had one of his generals, he was under a lot of pressure internationally, Saddam was. And this gentleman just happened to say, why don't you step down for a while and let us kind of take the reins for a bit until all this rolls over and then we just put you back in place. 48 hours later, a great big box showed up at his wife and family's house with him all tore up in it, according to what these people were telling me. He ruled Iran ruthlessly to maintain power. And the mullahs may do the same thing. We may see some very atrocious things that the mullahs use to stay in power on their own people. Not like we haven't seen that before. But when you're trying to figure out what is the military end state, how do we culminate this so that we don't lose momentum? How do we terminate this so that it's over with for the military? All that's got to be taken into account. And you have to remember, religious wars, as we have learned, can be ugly, really ugly. And so far, the United States and Israel have not made this a religious war. They haven't attacked the mullahs. They've got to know where they're at. If you can figure out where the Iranian chief of staff is, then you know where Ayatollah Khamenei is. You've got to. But again, you have to look long term. What is the end state in Iran? That's the question all of you should be asking. What is the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic end states in Iran? Diplomatically, who takes over for the mullahs? Who takes over for their State Department folks that are aligned with the mullahs? Informationally, you know, the death to America folks. Do you make them stop? Well, no, not really. It's a First Amendment right that they can say those things. It's only when they act on them that you have to go deal with it. And right now, we have a document that says clearly the Iranians are now after President Trump, President Netanyahu, because they are a enemy to God. They're trying to make this a religious war, an enemy to God. And you have to understand too, anybody that goes after these people, Trump or Netanyahu, are doing it not for the mullahs. They're doing it for God. They're motivated by that. And they stop at nothing because they feel their reward is in paradise. That's why I say they're risk averse. Because by going and getting themselves eliminated, they now have their ticket into their version of heaven. And folks, that's really hard to plan for. You know that? And as I read to you a couple of weeks ago from Ralph Peters and his paper, 25 superpower do's and don'ts, he said, don't let them hide behind religion. You can't. We're letting them do that here in the States and in communities. And I was listening to something this morning where in Texas, of all places, this religious cleric was saying, your constitution will not endure. We will replace it with Sharia law. In Texas? Really? So this is why I want all of you to think through what would be our end state in this, in the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic end states. If we just say, Iran's done. How do we know Iran's done? Mullah's gone, no nuclear program. Air Force, Army, Navy can defend the country, but can't go offensive. That's always one of the objectives. Their military can't go offensive. But look at all the money they have right now. Money that we gave them, unfortunately. Billions of dollars for them to go out and buy more equipment. And that's one of the other things that you got to take into account when you're dealing with an end state. And you're saying to yourself, okay, when do we stop? Do we start back up again when they start doing crazy stuff in the Strait of Hormuz or defending their border, whatever? These are really, really hard discussions to have when you're doing this kind of planning, folks. And when we were doing it with our students, we're doing it like in a 24-hour period, 2 classes, you know, class one day, class the next day. And they're supposed to figure out, okay, here's our courses of action. Here's our Here's our centers of gravity. Here's how what our military end state is. Here's how we figure we're going to culminate and terminate, all those kinds of things. But believe me, man, it takes a lot longer. Good example. When I was at the Joint Forces Staff College and I went to see Dr. Conrad Crane and got the package that he had submitted to the government on how to rebuild um, Iraq, I did an exercise on, we just schwacked North Korea. What are we going to do? How are we going to rebuild it? Are we going to rebuild it? Is the South Koreans going to do it? All the Pacific nations that are there pony up and they rebuild North Korea. And folks, you have to understand, there's whole provinces of North Korea that do not have running wire, sewers, or streetlights. You've all seen the picture of North Korea blacked out. So in each and every case, those military end states and when do we cease fire may be different. May be different. The help we get afterward may be different too. The South Koreans had squirreled away enough money to try and help in order to use to try and help rebuild North Korea. A lot of money. But you have to deal with the same kind of things: chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, an Air Force capable of carrying those, a Navy that is capable of sinking our ships. So, what I want all of you to do is, as this moves forward, particularly in Iran, but also look at North Korea, even a war in China, what would be our end state? What would we want China, North Korea to look like when we were done, militarily, informationally, diplomatically, economically? And there's no doubt the Iranians can support themselves because of oil. It's some of the best crude oil in the world. But again, when do you know to cease fire? When do you know that if I step any further than this line, I'm going to lose momentum? Or maybe the will of people back home. So, folks, as you move forward, listening to all this on the news and everything, remember to do your own analysis of what will this look like after we're done? What will Iran look like? What Iran should look like after whatever operations are done? What are our objectives that support those operations to remove the mullahs, remove their nuclear program, and defang their military in Iran? And then ask yourself the same thing for a war against China or a war against North Korea. So, a couple of my lessons learned from being at the Joint Forces Staff College teaching this stuff. A, planning is hard, particularly when you're trying to figure out this is what I think the country should look like when we are done. These are the military tools that they should have to defend themselves, the economic stuff that they need to survive and just become another empty hole or keep them from becoming an empty hole. When do we culminate and not lose momentum? When do we terminate and just say, from here on out, no military, we don't need it? Oh, here's another question. Who do we let in to help us rebuild? And what are their resources for doing that now that USAID is pretty much kaput? How do we do that? Who's going to help us do it? Because I think it was Colin Powell who said, you know, we're the ones that put all the feces in the bag. Now we're holding it. And now we got to deal with it. But seriously, when we do this kind of planning, we have to look at it, what the military end state is and what we want the country to look like before we cease fire, before we just say we're not going back in there. Because right now it looks like we're not going back in there, at least for right now. But that doesn't mean it won't happen. And again, a lot of my friends have said to me, Iran's never attacked us. And I've told them, bully. Yes, they have. They've been attacking us ever since the 2003 invasion. Literally. Hezbollah was holding up all of these terrorist organizations. Qasem Soleimani has the blood of 600 or more of our service members on his hands. And of course, in Israel, it's been going on a lot longer, a lot longer. So, um, I don't hold with I do not agree with anybody that comes up and says, why do we attack them? They didn't attack us. They've been attacking us since actually I think the 70s, blowing up our airplanes, passenger liners, taking hostages, killing our service members. All that stuff's been going on over there. And of course, all of you saw, President Bush declare victory, which you never declare. Never declare victory. We've got them on the run, boys, because they'll come back and surprise you, like ISIS did in Syria, in Iraq. Many of those attacks were being carried out by former Iraqis. One particular Iraqi general, geez, I can picture his face, can't remember his name. Anyway, he'd squirreled away a bunch of Saddam's money and was waging war against us. All of those new IEDs that could penetrate our armor, where'd that technology come from? Iran. And there's a lot of those people over there now, a lot of people that understand asymmetric warfare and how to deal with the Americans. Hope this has been interesting and educational to you, folks. I've been thinking about this for the last 2 days since some people have asked me, Mark, how do we know when to stop? How do we know when to say, okay, we're pulling back? And I'm telling you from numerous exercises over 3 years that determining what the military end state is, when you culminate, when you terminate, is very, very difficult because it's all based on, obviously, intelligence. And we've had some real bad intelligence failures. But just ask yourself this question. When you see us operating over there and you see our coalition partners operating over there, ask yourself, okay, what's the end state? What do we want this place to look like after we send all of our forces home? What do the people want, for example, in Iran, that we can provide them? And how do we remove this religious leadership that's causing so many problems because now they have a religious edict saying our president and Netanyahu are enemies to God, thereby putting more risk on our president and, of course, Israel's president to keep them alive. Thanks for joining me, folks, and talking to me and listening to me about military end states. And when do you stop? How do you stop? When you stop, what are you going to leave them with? And how are they going to function in the areas of national power, diplomatically, informationally, militarily, and economically? Logo signing off here. Folks, thanks for joining me today. I know this one is a little shorter. I'm actually doing an interview again tomorrow with Taz that will be a lot longer. He was the strategist for the surge and has dealt with a lot of things, Iranian, ISIS, and all the threats that we've had over there. And we're going to interview him tomorrow. That show will probably be up number 113, probably on Thursday. Again, this episode is brought to you by Valorous TV, the home of heroes. And folks, please go by and take a look at their YouTube channel at Valorous TV. They've got great documentaries, great movies, great films. They're handpicked by a great group of folks down in the Hollywood area. And you'll just love watching military, first responders, all of these great heroes, particularly that we honor this week, our military folks on our Independence Day. So go by Valorous TV on YouTube. If you like the show, folks, please join my Patreon channel, All Ranks Club, at the link below. Those of you that join at the designated driver and the by the bar get some pretty special stickers that are 7 inches for the back of your computer or water bottle. Weekly bar night where we just sit around and talk about aviation and all things military. One-on-one time with me also, and some content that you won't get anywhere else. Go to the link below and join. And every month you'll get one of these stickers. We're working on 15 more right now. Or if you just want to contribute to the show, I have my Venmo and my Zelle link down there in the show notes also. I really appreciate all of you being with me today. Again, this was a little different, but it's something I've been thinking about, and I've been getting a lot of questions about this. Mark, when do you culminate? When do you stop? How do you know when to stop? What do you leave them with when you stop? And those are all questions that, again, we taught when I was at the Joint Forces Staff College in the Joint Combined Warfighter School, because it's one of the elements of operational design. You got to know when to quit. And we didn't know when to quit, even though there was a huge plan created for Iraq to rebuild Iraq, never got implemented. Thanks again, folks, for joining me on this, the 113th episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show. I am Mark Hasara. Like I said, Thursday or Friday, we'll have another episode up with Taz, my good buddy Taz. He was the strategist for the surge and has a lot to talk about. Not only that, he's going to talk about the current infrastructure for the airlines, which is really going to be fascinating because, as I think a lot of you airline pilots know, it's broke and dangerous. So, thanks for joining me. Hope to see you again at the end of the week. Marcus Sarah, Sluggo, signing out here.